Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lempa, and on today's segment, and I call it that because I genuinely think we should make it a regular thing, but I'm joined by Lieutenant Colonel Steve Young as my co-host. Lieutenant Colonel Young joined the Army in the wake of the intervention in East Timor in January 2000. He was first posted to 3RAR and was halfway through his parachute course when 9/11 happened. Like many, this event shaped his career. His operational deployments that followed were to East Timor in 2002, Solomon Islands in 2007, and Afghanistan in 2011 and 2012. He's commanded at platoon, company and battalion level and served in logistics roles from the minutiae of tactical to the scale of strategic. He believes that we belong to a profession and that each generation is responsible for the professional development of the next, which is why he's taking time out of his busy long-term schooling currently.
Yeah, true.
I think what we're trying to do in this episode is we get, or in this segment more so, we get so bogged down at the tactical level, and when we go through our, as you've done, command appointments, it's incredibly difficult to lift the sights up and look more long-term and answer some of the, we always talk about this is where we're going to go and this is the, potent and lethal and all this sort of stuff. But how do we get back to looking at history? And we're going to answer some of the questions we currently have today while looking back in history. And I think Colonel Young is the perfect person to do that. He's unmatched in his ability to get junior officers specifically to really get enthusiastic where there was definitely no enthusiasm for history, and sort of best able to convey the messages of the past to fix today's problems. So welcome to our more regular segment, sir. But I suppose.
Thanks, Todd.
Yep.
Mate, really, really keen to be here. We've known each other for a few years now, and I basically enjoy every interaction that we have. Look, I think that the importance of history to a military professional is similar to an economist. So I remember in 2007 I was doing basically an Economics 101 subject as part of a degree. And the opening line of the textbook was that economics isn't a science. So the interplay of forces such as political and fiscal policy, monetary policy, and the makeup of an economy in terms of its industrial base, is it resource based, is it service based, they're never repeatable, and you can't as an economist just do an experiment that gives you the answer and that gives you data that you can then extrapolate. Instead, as an economist, what you need to do is look at history, look at how things actually played out, and then work out what's relevant now, what isn't, and how's the interplay of current forces going to interact with each other to be similar.
Yeah, and I suppose that complexity, I think trying to draw it back to that tactical level versus having the time to reflect, I think it seems as though sort of all majors post sub-unit command go to staff college as absolute optimists, and they go into the system completely optimistic, riding the highs of command, and then come out as sort of doomsday preppers, I suppose. That exposure for 10, 12 months of history must really put into play or put into context what we're currently trying to achieve and how difficult it may be. So I think reaching back, we'll really try to explain that and why that happens.
Yeah, I think that's true. If I think about my own sort of journey up to staff college, my understanding of history and its chronology was pretty good, but my ability to analyse and draw conclusions, lessons, and then apply it to my day-to-day work, that's where staff college actually gave me something. And I think if we think about other majors that we know that have been through similar, I think that's the big professional development that occurs at staff college. Yeah.
And so you talked about, obviously you had a passion before you went into staff college for military history, but so when did that start, at its most rudimentary sense?
Look, I think I was a frustrated HSC student in 1996, trying to work out how a love of history could turn into money, frankly. And I didn't really come up with a good answer to that. So 4 years later, I joined the army. That's kind of how my journey started, and I didn't understand how to apply it for a long time. But I think can I tell it's a short story about a particular battle which I think will illustrate why it is that history actually means something, and it's only history that we can draw some serious lessons from. So the battle I want to talk about is First Bullet Corps. So I want to set the scene. A lot of people will have seen the movie 1917 from a few years ago. Now, that movie took place about a week before Bullet Corps and a little further north to sort of situate you. The strategic circumstances are that the German army is lodged in France from 1914. 1916 is an awful year in terms of battles on the Western Front with the Somme and Verdun. We're talking about a little less than 1 million casualties on both sides or across both sides. And 1917 dawns, and the German army has decided that their main effort for that year is going to be the Eastern Front. So in order to free up troops for the Eastern Front, they conduct a tactical withdrawal. They build a defensive line further back. They conduct a tactical withdrawal which straightens their line, meaning that they can take divisions off that line and send them to the Eastern Front. Now, you've then got an advance to contact for the Allied armies to actually find out what that line is all about, and this is the context that Bullet Corps takes place. So, the Australian and British forces in particular advance kilometres where they had to spend 300,000, 400,000 lives to advance yards, and it's a confusing time. They're trying to work out what is actually happening here. They hit what's called the Hindenburg Line. Now, this is a line of fortifications that the Germans have built over the winter. Think about the sort of images that you see in the Ukraine now, and double or triple it in terms of the
scale.
The scale, yeah. So we're talking barbed wire that is 100 metres deep in places, and they hit that defensive line and they start sort of probing it a little. There's some great books sort of out there exploring this, but they have a look. They decide that there is Germans in there. Because they've advanced so rapidly, they haven't been able to bring up artillery quickly enough. So they end up putting tanks into action for the first time. 12 tanks as a way of doing it. Now, this is a corps level assault. It's 2 divisions. It's actually along a corps boundary, but there's a British division on the left, an Australian division on the right. Now, the Australian division's frontage is about 3 kilometres, and they basically form up 2 brigades up, 2 battalions up each brigade. So that's the sort of scale that we're talking about. We're talking about more than the entirety of the Australian army committed across 3 kilometres. To give you an example, that's the current Australian army, I should say. Yep. Now, there's a battalion that I actually want to focus on in this, and that's the 16th Battalion, which they're a bunch of West Australians, and they are the extreme right flank of this assault. It's pre-dawn. They're in an FUP that is an old sunken road, which basically it's this very shallow re-entrant that they're assaulting into. And this little sunken road is enough to stoop in to be able to stay away from enemy observation. The tanks are a little late. They're clunky. They're noisy. The Germans obviously go, "What's going on here?" But the tanks are the way that they're going to push through the wire. The 16th Battalion and the men of the 4th Division get up out of their FUP and start assaulting through with the tanks. The tanks tend to founder a bit, and there's a lot of frustration about that. They get through the wire. They get into the trench. They get into the second line of trenches as well, and they basically spend hours through that day fighting to hold those trenches. It's a very difficult battle to read about because you read about them putting up paraflares, red paraflares, calling in artillery, and their calls for artillery actually being overruled behind them because people think that they know better. There's a whole bunch of confusion there. The end result, they have to withdraw later on in the day, and there's a lot of books that you can read about, and it's not the specific battle that I want to sort of illustrate to you. But essentially, the 16th Battalion goes over the top with 700 men and 17 officers on that morning of the 11th of April. When they withdraw, they come back with 3 officers and 87 men.
Yeah.
That's the sort of scale. Now, pretty much any history that you read, and there are some cracking books about this, they kind of end at that point that, okay, look, some of them will go to the fact that 2 weeks later, General Birdwood, who was the Corps commander, came down to have a chat to them and hand out some medals and stuff. But pretty much they all end there. But the thing that fascinates me and where I think the lessons are for us is that 2 months later, that battalion was back in action. So, and that's at Messines. So I've sort of tried to talk about 1917 as a movie. There's also a movie called Hill 60, I think. That was an Australian movie that came out.
Awesome.
So that's about the Messines Ridge battle. These are major battles that we're talking about. And the 16th Battalion is the reserve battalion of the Reserve Brigade as part of that assault at Messines. So okay, all right, they're a reserve. They don't particularly get used. They are in the trenches, but they don't get used massively. So that's in June. By the time you hit September, they are at Polygon Wood. Okay, so now Polygon Wood is one of the key battles of Third Eep, a really significant battle, and they did indeed assault through that. So my question is, how do you take that core of people who came back from that 87 plus 3 officers, how do you rebuild combat power to be able to generate a force that can conduct an assault or can be a reserve force 2 months later and conduct an assault 5 months later? I think we've lost an understanding of that, and it's only through looking at history that you can think about how that might happen.
Because it just doesn't seem even on the realm of like possible in the current circumstances. You know what I mean? We don't even think to that point.
Yeah, but so what are the Ukrainians thinking? Are they thinking to that point? You know, we're living at the moment with an assault going into Russia, into the Kursk region of Russia, like something almost unthinkable. But the brigades that are conducting that well, you know, according to open source intelligence on Twitter, nothing more, those brigades are the same brigades that have been involved in fighting through the last 2 years. How have they been able to maintain combat power through defeats and rebuild it to the extent that they can then invade Russia? And some of the numbers are really interesting, and some of our cultural things. So I don't know, when I went through Duntroon, there was a term, LOB, left out of battle. And do they still do that?
Yeah.
Todd's at ADFA at the moment, so he's tracking some of this stuff more than what I am. So left out of battle, it was kind of a dirty word, right? It was, I've twisted my ankle, I've got a cold, or whatever it might be. Left out of battle in the First World War were your best people. They were your people trained in small arms tactics, your Lewis gunners, your Lewis gun instructors, your Mills bomb instructors. And they were left out of battle specifically to reconstitute the battalion. And we're not talking ones and twosies, we're talking about 100 who were kept away from that assault at Bullecourt. And I think that we've kind of lost that understanding that you actually can't commit your entire force to something.
Yeah. I think like that would directly contrast the current approach, which is that, you're right, it has sort of like a negative term, which it shouldn't, and we're trying to change that and all that sort of stuff with the culture. But like, how do we get to a point where we're actually reserving capability and specialists, you know what I mean, in that sense? Is that on the realm of possible?
I think if I think about my career, what I've seen is establishment reviews go through where at a unit level you have to justify the deployed role of every single position that you have. And that's that's the culture that has developed in the last 20 odd years. That everything needs to be okay. Well, this is what this person is doing. If this battalion needs to deploy, there's not then an understanding that actually 15 to 20% of your force needs to be away on courses. And courses, that's the other thing that I think the lesson from Bullock Corps. If I'll just call out the strength state. So a week before that battle that we're talking about, the strength state of the 16th Battalion is 35 officers and 1,095 soldiers. So that's what they were. But now the next strength state, 3 days after that battle, is 23 officers and 492. Now, out of that 492, you've got 100 left out of battle. You've got the 87 that came back from the assault. Then you've got the equivalent of today's sort of admin company. So there's a whole lot of drivers and field kitchens and the like that sit under the battalion headquarters. That's just how they structured it back then. And then you've somehow got to take that 492 people who have just seen all of their mates killed and develop that force back again. And how do you so what, 1 month after, they receive a full complement of officers. So they get a whole bunch of officers back, right? So they're back up to sort of 33 officers, but they've only got 640 soldiers. Again, how do you integrate that additional 200 soldiers into a battalion that's been shattered? How do you make them feel, okay, we can do this? That's an extraordinary leadership challenge for junior officers and junior NCOs in particular to rebuild that. And I don't think we have quite figured out how to do it. Or I think we've lost that understanding.
Yeah, that's. And do you think? I think most people would argue that, like, if the circumstance, there's always an argument that if the environment dictates that it must, it will, or if the context behind, if the reason for means that we will actually do that. Do you think that's true?
I do, but I think that it's all delayed. So if I lean on the Second World War as an example, Australia's mobilisation through the Second World War, when it was only Germany, was slow. It was really slow, really. If you look at the figures from those who joined up in 1914 versus those who joined up in 1939, there is a stark difference. Now, there's a whole lot of nuance around it about is it going to be an Australian Imperial Force or can I join the militia? And there's a bunch of nuance there. But ultimately, it took us a long time to work up to full mobilisation. So the trigger for us to fully mobilise was, I would argue, the fall of Singapore. So Singapore falls in I think late February, and 2 or 3 weeks later, you get our Prime Minister John Curtin giving a speech where he says that every Australian citizen must either fight, work, or perish. It's only at that point where you see a massive escalation in the size of the army and the size of the Air Force, and actually people start to properly scramble to get things underway in a way that we again struggle to conceive of. So, the statistics are that when the Australian Army reached its peak, according to the official histories, it's about 476,000. They actually decided that was too many for our population. They started to demobilise in 1943. It was just too many people. Our Air Force ended up being 180,000 people with 6,000 aircraft. And our Navy ended up being, I think, 60-odd thousand with 300 and something ships, of which 70 plus were what you could describe as surface combatants, like Corvette and above. Mm-hmm. If you take that level of mobilisation and you transpose it onto today's population, it ends up being a military of something like 2.2 million. That feels ridiculous to even say it for a country like ours, but that's the level of mobilisation that we hit when our country was strategically threatened. So then if you sort of take that and you go, okay, well, that was the 1940s. Hang on a second. Our politicians are talking about these being the most challenging strategic circumstances since the 1930s and 1940s. Is that actually realistic or is it not? And is there some other way that we could do it? Does somebody have a plan? And I just want to quote our last couple of prime ministers. So Scott Morrison in July 2020 said the world hasn't known a time of strategic uncertainty like this since the 1930s and 40s. Pretty explicit. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese stated in April 2023, we confront the most challenging strategic circumstances since the Second World War. Okay, well, that's what the Second World War looked like, an army of 476,000. Ridiculous. Okay, well, let's halve that and halve it again, say. How do we grow to 100,000 or 200,000? I don't know that the answer is anywhere other than history.
Yeah, and I think waiting for the threat to knock in the Pacific or at Singapore is like, it's difficult to fathom that would be the case. And you talked about slow to grow sort of thing, but like we can't wait that long, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, look, these are massive political questions, and I don't suppose to have a clear answer. But it does feel like there needs to be a plan, and I think again, if I lean on history a little, I guess that's what I'm here for. So I'll give it a crack. But the battle that I find interesting from the Second World War in the Pacific is Milne Bay. I find it interesting for a few reasons, but essentially it's a tactical lodgement within what is now Papua New Guinea. The task is to lodge and build three airfields actually, but they ended up building only two. We couldn't do it alone. Australia couldn't do it alone. We had to rely on the US for two capabilities. The first one was air defence, so they provided air gunners, and the second one was Seabees to actually build the airfields. Now, if we think about today, what capabilities might we need to rely on for the US? Well, the answer is airfield construction and
air defence.
Air defence.
Yeah.
So there are lessons of history there. Now, the other thing is about Milne Bay is that I think that, and I've done this in fact to one of your logistics officers courses that you were there for, Todd. I said, how many people does it take to conduct that tactical task? Do you remember what the answer of your course was?
This is really going to test me because I can't remember. But
So you tend to get people saying a couple of companies or a battalion, and I think that's just because that's
the functional groupings that people use to and you're grabbing at easy solutions there because you want to keep it inside the framework that we currently
So in 1942 it took two brigades. Now so that puts it at an ADF level task, and it's in 1942 we did that at the same time as we did Kokoda, at the same time as we just had an entire division become prisoners of war at Singapore. The 7th Division was coming back from the Middle East, and I think was in Ceylon at the time, now Sri Lanka. And we had the 9th Division still fighting in the Western Desert. And not only that, we had over 100,000 troops training at home for home defence purposes. So it's a good battle to think about the scale that what look like minor tactical tasks in our region actually need to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think to contrast that with the current approach, which is, we moved from, with the release of the NDS and IIP, I suppose a move from, I was in one brigade, so that three battle group advanced down Mount Bundy from north to south in the exact same way that every other, in the gun positions that already had all sighted, all good to go, to a shift in 2023 to a insertion by barge, commercial barge at the time, obviously, up into Tiwi Islands. And I suppose the first tactical action was the insertion of onto an airfield and then securing a sort of airfield with the MV-22. Obviously, I was in current ops in brigade headquarters at the time, and it was the MV-22 crashed, and tragic for the Marines at the time and us on the ground. But that sort of, I think, spread very thin on these tactical tasks, and it's easy to assume that one sort of battalion minus might be able to secure the airfield. One battalion minus might be able to both seize the beachhead and then move forward into the training area at the time. But what would realistically be the battlefield, I suppose, in the Pacific, the complexity of those scenarios, sort of, it's easy to assume that it's far more simplistic and takes far more manpower than it does.
Yeah, and I think so our strategy per the NDS is deterrence through denial. Now, denial, we've done it before. Second World War, we tried denial, and the thing about denial is that you need to be somewhere before your adversary, and that means an enduring operation somewhere, and that also means that you have to factor in rest, rotations,
Sustainment,
entertainment for people. People can't do 6 months, 7 days on. It dulls the fighting edge of that force if you start trying to do that. And I think that in our heads that's almost where we're at. But yeah, there needs to be another solution. And unfortunately, these sorts of questions that they rub up against things like the sovereignty of other countries and stuff like that. And I don't want to go down that path because it's again that is very much in the political sphere that we shouldn't be influencing necessarily. But the fact remains that these things take people and capability, and we're sort of potentially struggling to find an offset to mass at the moment through automation and AI, and I don't think that's been done successfully before. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, and like the whole, it goes directly against the argument of that deterrence factor or denial. Being in a region prior to and forecasting and having the ability to be in a location prior to, but then also your counter argument with the slow to grow type setup. It's to go back to your original vignette and the economics approach. I suppose that we're really lagging. So how do we achieve both? That is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it is, and it's expensive. And defence is an insurance policy. And how much do you want to spend on that insurance policy? How much as a society do you want to spend on it? It's a really difficult question.
Yeah. So if we are going to argue that we need that sustained presence and a larger force, I suppose this is a wicked problem and something far too difficult to solve in a 30-minute podcast. But how do we get to a point where we're actually recruiting the numbers that it does actually grow rather than just sitting? And are there relevance or sort of examples in history that can show us how to grow to that sort of point prior to that the Singapore example that you spoke about in World War II?
So I think I'll answer that by, I don't know if you remember when we worked together, Todd, that one of the first things that I showed the battalion was a speech by General Angus Campbell. He was giving a speech to ASPI on the war in 2025. It was a conference done in, I think, 2019 from memory. So he started his presentation with a quote from Trotsky, which was, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." And he then went on to outline that a war in 2025 would be more bloody than we anticipate, and that governments, democracies, when they are faced with a threat, become more authoritarian. And he leaned on sort of the example of John Curtin through the 1940s with the Fight, Work and Perish piece to try to illustrate that. So I think that it's, while any society threatened, take Ukraine, take Russia, in fact, I mean, they certainly articulate that they feel threatened. They will lean on coercive measures such as conscription. But before you get to that point, there is also other ways to motivate your society to serve. John Blaxland, who is he's an academic at ANU. In fact, he's on a secondment, I think, at the moment in the US. But he has developed an outline of a plan for national service, which is called OSNACS, which is on a mostly voluntary basis, but there are significant incentives to join the military. So whether or not Australia needs to go down that path, I think it's an incredibly hard thing for the party of Gough Whitlam, who removed our last conscription, our conscription scheme in the 1970s to even talk about this. The last time that we looked seriously at it was actually 1999. So there's a parliamentary report. If you just Google National Service Australia, you'll get it. And essentially, after East Timor, they were trying to work out how they would maintain a larger than brigade presence in East Timor in an enduring manner. And one of the solutions they looked at was conscription. Now they didn't end up going down that path, but I guess I highlight that to say that it's not actually as taboo as what you might think. It's just that we aren't talking about it at the moment. Yeah, there's another one. I tend to ask senior officers about this when they come, and the best answer that I've received, and they're Chatham House, so I'm not going to give names, but the best answer that I've received is that our first step is actually to take every gap year person that we can. At the moment, apparently, and I don't know the stats, we end up turning away some gap years that are suitable. Well, that seems crazy to me. I think we should be grabbing hold of every single person who shows an interest and putting them in a uniform for some length of time.
Yeah, and obviously we'll try and get Colonel Trevor Watson on to talk about recruiting and stuff, because we're at the mercy of some contracting and some issues there, but trying to expedite the process of, when someone does show a genuine interest, getting them, through the door and through training and stuff, which is an interesting segue, because we talk about training, I suppose. What does we've currently got the first Recruit Training Battalion in Kapuka, and then we have and I'm just talking to an army context here, RMC as it's known. Everyone holds on super. It's changed now to a 12-month program, and interestingly, ADFA hasn't changed at all. The SSTs are exactly the same. It's just that the RMC continuum has sort of shrunk to like 11 months, which is on standard with Sandhurst and the like. But it does make people nervous about the quality of officer or quality of soldier coming out as these courses start to get reduced. But what does it look like when we genuinely, we talk about Scheyville and Portsea and, other recruit training battalions? Like, what does that look like from a training base growing, on that threat becoming real? What does it look like?
So, well, let's just talk really briefly about the institutions that you just mentioned. So, Duntroon, it used to be, and I'm talking I think 1985, 1986, I think.
Yeah, 1986. Yeah,
at 1986, ADFA opened. Okay, so you, from an army perspective, you used to have Duntroon, which was a 4-year degree course that produced officers that are today's equivalent of ADFA grads. You then had Portsea, which was direct entry, but more so even taking soldiers of identified potential and sending them on an 18-month course. So that's what was transplanted in 1986 to RMC. It was the Portsea course, and it then went on its own path of evolution from that. Scheyville was something different. Scheyville was the officer training establishment that took national servicemen and put them into officer training, and it was. You might know better than me. I think it was either a 3 or a 4 month course. It was short. Now the thing about that though is that as part of a national service scheme, because you are recruiting from a broader pool, you can then conduct aptitude testing on that pool and take the absolute cream of the crop and send them to Scheyville and make them an officer, a second lieutenant in this case, after 4 months. When you're not conscripting and you are simply taking people, I don't know if you can get much below that sort of 12-month mark. I don't know if that makes sense, but when you can,
it seems counterintuitive to some degree, because you're widening the pool band and then obviously taking on more, which everyone assumes is going to drop quality, right? In applicants and the like. But then you're saying that because you have a wide pool to test from, you can be selective and then inherently deliver less training, I suppose, in the context of the scenario as well. There's a little bit of that, necessity to run a shorter course. But so that's what you're sort of arguing, is that you have a bigger pool to select from and then you select into, which is completely counter to what we do currently.
It is. And I don't think that there was I don't know, I haven't read into this, but I haven't read things that say that there was a notable difference between a Scheyville graduate and a Portsea graduate, for instance. I'm not sure. Tim Fisher, our former Deputy Prime Minister, was a Scheyville graduate, and I don't think anybody could argue that he had a leadership deficit. So that's one way. The other way, there's also a World War I example. Like, for instance, with Bullock, we sort of spoke about how they lost something like 17 of their officers or 15 of their officers through that assault. And then within a month, they'd been boosted up to 33. Well, where did those officers come from? Australia plugged into the British officer training scheme, where basically they identified soldiers who had potential and sent them away on a course. Now, that course, it wasn't long, but it also wasn't like a 2-weeker. It was something like 3 months, and I don't know. I'd have to look that up to see how long it was. But that was training the army at that time. I might just use this opportunity for a quick segue onto a pet, interest project. So one of the things about growing an army is as you're sort of talking about the dilution of quality, and the fact that...
Or the perceived dilution as well. I think the perception is sometimes not reality, but we all hold on to the institutions that we went through, Kapuka being, the home of the soldier. Like, we don't want to drop the quality because inherently we have to deal with the circumstances behind that. But I think, removing some components of a made-up, and I use that term very loosely, made-up training continuum to then, accelerate. Does it actually change the quality? I think the perception is more than is the reality, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, my concern. So any army that grows, there is a. Okay, let's remove the word quality and insert the word experience. Okay, so you have to have a dilution of experience. So, for instance, you graduate from ADFA and RMC, you think you've got 4 years as a platoon commander. All of a sudden, the army grows to be, not one division plus a reserve division, but instead we're aiming for a 4 or 5 division army. Well, a bunch of those lieutenants who thought that they had years before needing to worry about things are all of a sudden thrust after 2 years into company command, for instance, or something similar to that. Everybody sort of moves up and you backfill in. That's what happens within an army. So that is a dilution of experience. You can't get away from that. Mitigating that dilution of experience through trying to adapt and learn lessons quickly is one of the sort of pivotal things of whether or not your army is going to succeed or fail. I would argue, and I think I'm probably in good company there arguing that. But the thing is, so if we again, I'm going to reach back to sort of the First World War to illustrate this point. So pre-1914, Australia had a militia force that grew out of General Kitchener. The guy who is on all the posters through World War I, big moustache, with a big finger pointing, we want you. That's General Kitchener. We got him to do a review of what the Australian nation after Federation should look like in terms of an Australian military. And he recommended a militia force with, I think it was something like 2 divisions of light horse and X amount of divisions of infantry. So we were kind of in the process of building that up. The thing is, though, when World War I happened and we all of a sudden got flooded with volunteers, we've all of a sudden got this division that we're going to send over to Egypt that eventually goes to Gallipoli, and then there's another division forming at the same time, a 3rd, a 4th and a 5th, plus the light horse elements. But nobody has ever seen on an exercise more than a company. How do you bridge that experience gap? The way that we did it in the First World War was we imported British officers into key positions to try to backfill that experience gap. I don't know how we do it
No, I was going to say,
again,
trying to overlay that onto the current circumstance, working with the US significantly. Like, is there an appetite to like relinquish your command or sit underneath a US-led force element or a commander? Because everyone wants that sanctity of command, I suppose. And you're right, necessity brings with it, necessity. But are we willing to do that? Like, is that on the realm of possible?
I think
without getting to the point where we're like, okay, backs against the wall, this is it. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that the high level answer is yes. That are we willing to be part of a joint task force that is led by a US commander? Sorry. I think the answer to that is yes. In the First World War, you had British brigade commanders of Australian brigades. That I don't see that as necessarily viable. But would Australia provide a formation or a joint task force to a joint task group that's led by the US? Yes. The really high level answer to your question is that when you are unprepared for conflict and it sneaks up on you and punches you in the face, you give up your sovereignty. Or you give it up to somebody. You either give it up to your ally or you give it up to your adversary. So in the Second World War, MacArthur comes from the Philippines. He evacuates the Philippines. He's ordered out of the Philippines, I should say, by the US president, and he comes to Australia. The first thing our Prime Minister does is he subordinates the entirety of the Australian military to MacArthur. Hasn't even consulted with the American president. He gives up our sovereignty to General Douglas MacArthur. He does that because he wants American buy-in, and he is willing to spend Australian blood and treasure to ensure that the US is fully part of this war that he defines as existential. So, yeah, I mean, his alternative was that the US maybe isn't quite as involved. Now, maybe that wasn't going to happen anyway, but you've probably got an aligning of national interests at that moment. But yeah, that's the consequence for not being fully prepared is you give up sovereignty.
I can only imagine what necessity would need to come to be able to, fathom that, I suppose, or stomach it. You talked before about, and I think for more at the tactical level and then bridging it up, but moving from what you thought was platoon command to then subsequently company command or combat team command. I remember you delivering some PME when we first got to the unit as a commanding officer, and you asked one of your lieutenants to come up and sort of given a vignette, and you asked him to come up just as a visual aid, draw Belgium as a country on the whiteboard so that you could then illustrate the points that you were going to make about one of the battles. And he sort of walked up incredibly sheepishly and drew what I think, without a protractor, the perfect circle on the board, which does not, Belgium is not a perfect circle. But to think that lieutenant or platoon commander could then be thrust into the sort of a really young combat team commander or company commander, like what does that look like? Or the realities, I suppose.
So Todd, I feel like you've made me sound like a really unfair CO there. I asked for a volunteer and I also asked for who had studied geography at ADFA. Ryan Munro, big shout out to you. So I don't actually think that stuff matters that much. A good friend of mine, Jed Kearns, and I used to argue around this a little bit. So Jed he's not dead, is very firmly of the mind that tactical mastery is the absolutely critical thing for a junior officer. And I agree with him. And what I was trying to give you guys was additional context for if the military needed to grow really quickly, that you would have some sort of reservoir that you could reach back to and go, I kind of remember this stuff from somewhere. I don't think it matters that much that you can't necessarily draw
Belgium.
Draw Belgium on the map.
Or locate it on the map.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. A funny moment. Yeah.
But I think that's what we're trying to achieve, I suppose, in this segment as well, is to be able to reach back and maybe not have all the answers, but know that something exists and be like, oh, do you remember what Colonel Young spoke about with mobilisation, or, what training institutions look like and how large an army has to be? I suppose that's the exact sort of purpose of this.
Yeah, and like, so Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And I think that drawing firm lessons from history is folly. I don't think it works like that. I think you can reach back and you can make observations. But
so too, I think, is the drawing a distinction between that was then and this is now.
Yeah.
It's far too often is the case that we completely distinguish the current circumstances from those of the past, rather than acknowledging that there are definitely more similarities than differences.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. So there's definite similarities, but the thing is that I think if I can reach back to that first example of economics, the fact that you can't necessarily anticipate the exact interplay of all of the forces of conflict. And I'll give you a modern example. So you've got, at the moment, if you had have taken the 2022 and 2023 examples of the war in Ukraine, you might turn around and say the idea of a mechanised assault on a position is dead. Like that is no longer a thing that armies can do. It's too difficult with things like Javelin, with UAVs, all of that sort of stuff. It's dead. And yet, 1 week ago, the Ukraine invaded Russia in Kursk, and it's sketchy, but they're 30 kilometres into Russia with a mechanised column of some description, which again it's difficult to work out exactly what it is, but there is no firm lessons because the interplay of how these forces are going to interact are uncertain.
And I think that uncertainty is the best place to leave sort of this episode, and talking about mobilisation and how difficult it would be through the lens of history. I think next time we meet, we talk about age and how different ages affect warfare, and maybe the interplay between sort of 1 div and 2 div, and how how the fight would be fought in the event that both divisions had to fill distinct roles. Thank you so much for coming on, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.